That's the alarm. 12 o'clock, high noon. Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to a talk by the Middle East Today talk series, which is run and sponsored by the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the Department of Middle Eastern Studies. The series was launched in 2022. We basically run talks on current affairs. So far we've had talks on Iran's Women Life Freedom Movement. We've had talks on Turkey's elections and the re-election of Erdogan. We've had a talk on the Israeli elections and the election of the right wing that is currently in power. And I should probably introduce myself. My name is Nahid Siamdus. I'm an assistant professor of media and Middle Eastern studies at the Department of Middle Eastern Studies, and I teach on media and politics in the Middle East. We try to invite, we do have speakers from outside of UT as well, but we try to draw on our own faculty as much as we can. And this brings me to today's talk. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Andrew Lee Butters here, who's a professor of journalism at the Journalism School. He is here to give us a talk on the media coverage of the war in Gaza. Professor Butters is a former Middle East correspondent and Beirut bureau chief for Time magazine. He spent a decade covering every major country in conflict in the region, from the war in Iraq to the Arab Spring. He's a former lecturer in political science at Yale University, a former fellow at the Reuters Institute at the University of Oxford, and he has worked in New York for Bloomberg News and The Economist magazine. He has degrees from Brown University and Cambridge in history and journalism from Columbia University. And full disclosure, as his spouse, I can assure you that he follows the news very, very closely, sometimes too closely, based on the number of hours he spends glued to his phone. So I couldn't think of anybody better to actually give us an account of media coverage of the war in Gaza. And before I start, I feel like I don't really have to do this in this room, but I just want to encourage us to maintain a civil space for conversation and discussion and exchange. We are in a university setting. I know some of these topics are, hotly contested, but let's have a good space for conversation here. Andrew will speak for about 40 minutes, and then I'll open it up for questions to the audience. I would also like to mention that this talk is also sponsored by Israel Studies at the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So, thank you for that introduction, Professor Siamdus. I hope you all please don't hold it against her that we're married. She blames herself enough already. But I'm still honored to be here and to be able to talk to you about this subject that we care so much about, and feel privileged that we're allowed to have this space, a civil space, when so much about this conflict and about how it's discussed is so profoundly uncivil. And so I tell my journalism students that that when we come to our reporting and we come to the issues that we care about with our full selves and our full identities, but that we include in those identities that of being a journalist or being scholars, and that space between our identities and our avocations creates a space for non-reactivity that we can use to probe further, to ask questions, or just take notes of things that may outrage us. So I hope we guys can practice that, and in that spirit, after I'm done, feel free to be reactive to me with your full identity. So if you have comments, I don't mind comments and questions as long as we're all cool about it, okay? So thank you. We all know the story at this point of October 7th, but I would like to ask you guys to imagine it not just as a massacre, but as a mass-mediated massacre, right? So on October 7th, Hamas breaks out of Gaza and goes on a rampage in southern Israel, and they film it, right? So they killed about 1,200 Israelis, majority of them civilians, including 36 children, and recorded spectacular filmic attacks, right, and war crimes captured by Hamas fighters with GoPros. Hamas videographers were along for the ride, and by Gazan journalists who rushed to the scene. Why did they do that, right? The attack and its promotion was meant to get the Palestinian issue back on the front burner of world affairs. And with Hamas in the lead of the Palestinian national movement, right, to derail attempts by Arab countries who've been normalizing relations with Israel without solving the Palestinian issue, and most importantly, to draw Israel into an asymmetric war on Hamas's turf, right? In Gaza, where there's almost a guarantee of spectacular carnage and military quagmire. Another goal was perhaps to trigger a larger regional war with Hezbollah and Iran coming to the rescue. So Hamas had been wildly successful on almost all these fronts except the last one, right? So far, Hezbollah and Hamas have been kind of half-hearted in their support. They say thanks, but no thanks. Hezbollah is harrying the northern front of Israel. But so far, and Iranian proxies in the region, like the Houthis in Yemen, have responded by closing shipping in the Red Sea. But so far, there seems to be not a desire to head fully into the brink of a regional war. So almost as soon as the actual war broke out in Gaza, a media war breaks out too. Not just of Hamas's propaganda, but a media war between pro-Israel spokespeople and activists and Palestinian ones, a war of public diplomacy and media criticism, right? Pro-Palestinian activists wanted to use this moment to highlight the occupation, to shine a light on why Palestinians were trapped in Gaza to begin with. And Israelis and their public diplomacy campaigns focused on sympathy for their victims and affirmation for the newfound sense of national vulnerability and the vulnerability of Jews in the global diaspora feeling the rise in anti-Semitism. But it's also important that to recognize that part of this campaign it was also to delegitimize any rationale of what the other is trying to do, right? And for pro-Palestinians, that's for pro-Israelis, that's to delegitimize the rationale for fighting against the occupation, but also really to clear the way for what Israeli officials, Israeli spokespeople, and public diplomacy activists knew was coming, which was going to be a spectacular response. So why does that spectacular response need a PR campaign, right? Because the way Israel has been fighting wars in recent memory have been spectacular PR disasters, right? Israel has major advantages when it comes to public diplomacy, especially in this country, with political activists, civil society groups, and allied media critics kind of loosely coordinating with the Israeli government and putting pressure on news media. But it loses a lot of that when Israel goes to war. And it loses that because its military strategy has a face made for radio, right? It's generally, they fight in a way that's called the Dahieh Doctrine, named after a Shia neighborhood in South Beirut, where I lived for 10 years, not in Dahieh, but in Beirut. So the last time Israel fought a war with a proper Arab army was in 1973, the Yom Kippur War. Since that time, its wars have been fought with militant organizations that have been embedded in their local populations. And so these wars have been political and military disasters, right? Starting in 1982 with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Israel invaded Lebanon to go after the PLO, which at that time was based in Palestinian camps in Lebanon, especially along the southern border with Israel, and was staging these similar kind of spectacular attacks against civilian targets in northern Israel on a smaller scale, but of a kind of what Hamas did on October 7th. Israel responded by invading in order to drive them out, was successful in driving the PLO out, but in a classic case of kind of military blowback, ended up sparking the creation of the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah, which formed to fight the Israeli invasion, who are by far more dangerous than any other militant group that Israel has ever faced, right? So then when there was a brouhaha between Hezbollah and Israel in 2006 in southern Israel, this was the start of what we now call the Daye Doctrine, which is essentially like Israel saying, we're going to bring a bazooka to a knife fight, right? So any aggression from their adversaries is going to be met with overwhelming military force, and it's basically Daye was leveled in an aerial bombardment campaign, as was much of southern Lebanon, and so it's almost saying like thumbing its nose at the rules of proportionality. It's saying we're going to be disproportionate when we come at you, and there are lots of people in the Israeli security establishment who think this is an effective strategy, and in fact, after 2006, that border was pretty darn quiet until recently, right? But in the meantime, right, that massive aerial campaign of southern Lebanon and Beirut, rather than turning the Lebanese population against Hezbollah, which there were huge chunks of Lebanese society already against Hezbollah, right? Especially among Christian Lebanese and Sunni Lebanese, right? That campaign allowed Hezbollah to have an opening to basically take over the Lebanese state, right? First of all, they're the ones with guns and military training who could stand down the Israeli army in 2006. The rest of Lebanese political society was no match for them. And in the intervening years, Iran has rearmed Hezbollah, now that it's in control of an entire state, the airport, the ports, etc., that it has a massive military arsenal, and military technology has also changed quite a bit, and so that gives more power and force to these kind of drones, light rockets, ballistic missiles, and this kind of puts more power in the hands of these asymmetric actors. All right. But some of you are saying, wait a second, back up. What do you mean Israel has advantages in the American media and the Western media to get its story across? For some of you, and for many critics, what they see instead in the kind of the media arena of the American press is an environment that's hostile to Israel, that hyper focuses on this country, this issue, that holds it to standards that it doesn't hold to any other country, and I just put the cover up of a well-known Israeli media activist Noah Tishby, and my response to that would be yeah, there is a hyper focus on Israel. There is perhaps a different set of standards that some foreign correspondents use when we cover Israel. that the message but a lot of that is rooted in the message that, by and large, Americans hear, if they were hearing directly from people who cover the region and cover this place, is different from the message that's often coming through that especially American Jews hear through their mainstream institutions, and certainly the messages that we hear through American mainstream politicians, right? It's because we've covered other sides to this story, right? And I would also say that as a former foreign correspondent myself, a lot of what we do and when we think about stories is to think about how we can add value to our audiences. What message, what's worth me risking my life to cover something? It's not to tell people what they already know, right? It's not to add to a way of thinking about things that's existed, for 30 years and is not solving anything, but to tell my audience and my readers what they don't know, what they don't see, and ultimately the best thing that we can do is often tell our readers how we're part of a problem, right? So that always creates a certain dissonance. But I would have to say, for as much as there's that sentiment among foreign correspondents and people in the field, we don't get to publish our stories ourselves unless we have, some unpaid site on Semaphore or something. We're working through layers of power in media organizations that are embedded in the fabric of American life and share the dominant values of our culture, right? And so I have a tough time seeing how these media organizations in multicultural places and Jew-friendly spaces like DC and New York City are somehow kind of havens of anti-Semitism, and that's what's directing this kind of coverage. I'd also like to point out that the Gaza war is really being covered in New York. It's being covered in Jerusalem. It's being covered in Washington, right? Field correspondents are not running the show on this story because my friends and colleagues can't get into Gaza for the most part. All right, so when I talk about bias, right, I just want to take a moment and think about how bias operates in the media. And often the way that it works is through how events are framed. And so quickly, little media theory dive into media framing. These are often the context and the background through which action is interpreted. They're often simple kind of shorthands that masquerade as natural, as common knowledge and conventional wisdom, and a meta-narrative that allows viewers and readers to absorb the kind of conventional meaning of things quickly, right? So here's an example, right? The latest news from Washington, right, is often covered under a frame of the latest political dysfunction from Washington, the latest political polarization, right? A different way of framing that, and that's been being pushed recently by progressive media critics, is to frame this, right, instead as, well, actually, it's not equal polarization. There is one side, the Trumpian Republican Party, that's lost its interest in democracy and governance, and that's why there's this the latest round of circus why there's a clown show in Congress, right? So there have been three kind of basic frames of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that I can think of, right? The first one is it's terror, it's a two-sided conflict, or it's an occupation, right? The war on terror frame, posits that Israel is on the front line of a war for Western values, for peace and security, that Arabs hate Israel because of anti-Semitism, because corrupt authoritarian regimes in the region look for scapegoats to absolve themselves of their internal problems and their security states, and the popular rage in the region towards Israel is a kind of diversion from their own humiliation at the failure of their societies to modernize. This frame is favored by right-wing media and pro-pundits. Right, all these frames contain kernels of reality, of course, but they shape the kind of overall interpretation of these news in specific directions, right? Then there's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict frame, right? That they're two rival national movements fighting over the same slice of sacred homeland. And this is the frame where everyone is comfortable talking about, right? The mainstream media is kind of comfortable talking about this way. This is the norm for when we all inhabit spaces together. But it's not the only kind of way, but increasingly there are progressive media activists and pro-Palestinian activists been asking us to look at this in a different way, and that's the way of an occupation frame. That Israel is running an apartheid-like occupation in Gaza and the West Bank, and it's denying the right of refugees from the War of Independence in '49 to return their homes in Israel proper, right? So, my own experience as a foreign correspondent, I spent 10 years living in Beirut, but I had the privilege of basically spending my summers in Jerusalem when the Jerusalem bureau chief had kind of sabbatical to look after his elderly parents. And so I got to run, every summer got to run the Jerusalem bureau and had the privilege of being able to cover so many different sides of this conflict, from the refugee camps in Lebanon to the southern border, to visiting all the places I'd seen from the other side, going to Gaza, to sitting in Israeli homes in Sderot that had been hit by rockets from Gaza. But I found that the two-sided framework was inadequate for me to write the stories that I wanted to write. And that it didn't suit the reality of what I was seeing when I was covering the conflict. That the reality for the 30 years previous to October 7th wasn't really a two-sided conflict anymore. That Israel had won. That it had control over the land and territories that were disputed, and that kind of two-sided narrative obscured and prevented a lot of stories from being written about occupation. Now, because you guys are an academic audience, I feel a little self-conscious and feel like I want to drop a little cultural theory and mention French linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, who said all meaning and culture and communication is a series of binary oppositions, like good and evil, black and white, north and south, east and west, civilized barbarian, and that framing things in binary oppositions is inherently unstable, and that one side is inherently more privileged than the other, right? But I could also simply say that journalists love access. They love power. They love being in the mix, and that because Israel is the major player in American domestic politics that Palestine isn't, you can have situations where someone like Benjamin Netanyahu, who is, at this point hated in his own country, who's refused media interviews for a long time at home, and where Israeli journalists are warning their Western compatriots, if Benjamin Netanyahu is offering to do an interview with you, it means he thinks you're an idiot and he's going to lie to you. And yet, when he comes to this country, he's given red carpet treatment and does the round on the Sunday talk shows, right? We can't help ourselves, and we've seen that with how the media handles Donald Trump. But on the other hand, social issues of social injustice often go undercovered because somehow an occupation in its natural state seems to us, especially with this power imbalance, doesn't seem newsy. It just is. It's just like, deep-seated ethnic hatred of 100 years. What's new? 1,000 years. What's new, right? When in fact, occupation and living under occupation is a daily system of abuse, right? But these things don't get covered until they explode. And then more often than not, it's the pathologies of the oppressed that gets covered as much as the underlying system. So here's an example. I was commissioned by my editors at Time magazine to work on a story about the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon for the 60th anniversary of the creation of Israel in 2008. It was their idea. Hey, we want a story from Israel and we want a story about Palestinians, right? We're going to get both sides. We're going to cover this equally, right? So I spent 2 months going into Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. It was an incredible assignment. It was incredible to have that as a focus to do. I think I did some of the best reporting of my career, the best writing. I certainly did the most dangerous reporting of my career. I met with an Al-Qaeda bomb maker who was hiding in Ain al-Hilweh, in a part of Ain al-Hilweh that was so dangerous that even Fatah didn't go there. And of course, Palestinian refugee camps are under no jurisdiction but their own because of an agreement after that '82 war. So if something had happened to me with this guy who's the only clearly psychotic person I've ever met in my life, no one was coming in for me, and that ended up just being one silly damn quote in the whole story. So I worked my butt off, right, and wrote a portrait of 4 generations of refugees and their descendants facing multiple generational traumas, multiple different wars, but frozen in time. Like there's no future for them, just a past. Like every day is like 1949 in a camp, right? But if your story is timeless, there's no time hook. And there was the, journalists love, publications love anniversaries because they give you an artificial time hook to talk about like broad stories. Well, I missed that 60th anniversary time hook. There was a space crunch. My side of the story got bumped. The Time ran with an essay from Jerusalem and some photos by my former colleague David Rubinger, who's a great Israeli photojournalist who has like one of the most iconic photos of 20th century photojournalism. The Israeli soldiers at the Western Wall in 1967. So don't begrudge David, he's an incredible guy and did incredible work, but my story almost never saw the light of day because there was no longer a time hook. Finally, I just had an editor ram it through the international edition, which is like the junior varsity version of Time. So it ran a year later, and Time hasn't run anything about Palestinian refugees in Lebanon since then, right? The issue of exiled Palestinian refugees and whether or not they have a right to return to the nation's now, inhabit the nation of Israel. It's one of the most difficult and most important questions facing this conflict, and it doesn't get covered, right? There's no time hook for it. On the other hand, right, forgotten people can't generate news, but states can generate news. They have that power. They can even generate whole news cycles, right? So an example, a recent example, right after the International Court of Justice released its finding that there is reason to fear that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza, the Israeli government announced that it has evidence that 12 UN employees who work for the main aid agencies serving Palestinian refugees, UNRWA, which is always hard to say, which has about 13,000 employees, that accused 12 of them of being involved in the October 7th attacks. Right, so that news cycle, timed right after that release, starts running some of those stories about the ICJ findings out of the news cycle. And it also becomes a moment for the media to resurface some longstanding Israeli grievances about the UN. And yet it's still unclear what's actually in that dossier, the Israeli government. It's not even clear that who in the Israeli government wanted this story out, because they do seem to be backtracking about it, because not everyone in the Israeli government wants to see UNRWA fall apart. But the dossier hasn't even been delivered to the UN. Supposedly it's been given to the US government. That they say they can't verify the charges, but find them troubling. And on the back of that, there's another news cycle about how different countries are, based on this, are suspending aid to UNRWA in the middle of war at a time when there are millions of displaced Palestinians, and that UNRWA is their basically main and only lifeline for essential life-saving aid. All right, so let's get back to October 7th and Hamas's attack, right? So we talked about media frames, right? And what makes news? Well, Israel being attacked, Israel at war, is huge news in this country, and we all know that. It's the kind of thing that's almost as close as the U.S. going to war, right? And Israel being attacked generates huge sympathy in the U.S. media, right? But that structural bias is kind of reversed when Israel goes to war. So much of Israel's media and public diplomacy starts to began pushing that first frame of Israel, the terror frame, and specifically that this attack was Israel's 9/11, right? With Hamas as latter-day Al-Qaeda or Nazis or ISIS, and that there's no both siding a fight against implacable evil, right? But that war on terror, that 9/11 brand, is not what it used to be in America. Our own experiences with the military campaigns that we went down, the paths we went down, and the failed wars, the civilian casualties, the lost generations of soldiers, the suspicion we have of our government, the damage to our reputation as a law-abiding country, is palpably felt by the news media, which covered all these things. So that ended up not being a successful framing device and didn't last very long. And then it's important also to get in what is like a very difficult subject, is that some of these, the horror stories that came out of Israel entirely deserve the space and the sympathy that they got. But questions have arisen about to what extent, at the edges, how extreme some of these atrocities were, right? There is no good way to be murdered, right? There's no okay way to be killed. I just want to make that clear. But that in the febrile moments after these attacks, they were injected into the kind of media ecosystem with some stamps of authoritative approval came some of these stories that later turned out to be exaggerated. According to Israeli media, which has been investigating this, and Israeli media has been asking, like, why do this? And I just want to play you this clip from that one of these news shows.
אזור מלחמה כאמור, ערב טוב לכם, אנחנו כבר נדווח על המתווה החדש של עסקת החטופים, האם הוא יפצח את המבוי הסתום, אבל עוד לפני כן, תראו את הדברים הבאים שאומר סמח"ט חטיבת כפיר בערוץ 14, שימו לב.
אנחנו מגיעים לקיבוץ בארי, ושם תופסות אותי עוד שתי תמונות מרכזיות בלחימה, אפרופו האכזריות של האויב. אחד זה מעון ילדים, שבאמת, חוץ מתום אין שם שום דבר אחר, שנשחטו ופשוט הרגו אותם.
בתוך ילדים?
בית, שמונה תינוקות מתים. ועוד תמונה שתפסה אותי, היא שראיתי את ג'ניה, זיכרונה לברכה, אישה מבוגרת מקיבוץ בארי, שאני רואה את המספר חרוט לה על היד. אתה אומר, היא עברה את השואה באושוויץ, ובסוף מתה בקיבוץ בארי, זה לא משהו שהוא... בכלל, אתה מצליח להבין אותו.
ובכן, לא נרצחו 8 תינוקות במעון בבארי, מבהיר דובר בארי, ואין בבארי אישה בשם ג'ניה. תראו עוד דברים שאומר לא מזמן, גם אדם שהוא חלק מצה"ל.
היו פה גם ילדים, תינוקות שנתלו על חבל כביסה ממש בשורה אחת. אמר מאוד קשה, כשראיתי את זה, זה גם כן זעזע אותי. אתה לא מבין בדיוק באמת מה אתה רואה מול העיניים, האם זה תמונה או שזה באמת מציאות, היה מאוד מאוד קשה להקל את זה.
בוסקילה מדבר על אירוע כביכול בכפר עזה, אבל לכפר עזה הבהירו מזמן שהאירוע הזה פשוט לא קרה. אגב, הוא אמר את הדברים, נאמר לו שזה לא קרה, ואז הוא אמר אותם שוב בסיור של עיתונאים זרים שהגיעו למקום, ושימו לב מה אומר דובר המשטרה לתקשורת הזרה לא מזמן, שימו לב.
And pregnant women cut open. Guys, the things that happen here are so sick. This is not a Netflix show, and it's not a cable news show. None of that. No, this is real life.
גם זה לא קרה. אז קרו כל כך הרבה דברים נוראים, אכזריים, מהאכזריים ביותר שניתן לבצע כלפי בני אדם ב7 באוקטובר. בשביל מה מיקי רוזנטל נאמרים דברים כאלה ש...
So their panelists go on to examine this and ask themselves, and they're stunned by this, and they ask themselves, well, maybe it's PTSD, maybe it's maybe just the confusion of the moment. Why would you exaggerate something that doesn't need? It's exaggerating that is horrible enough on its own right. Well, one of my explanations for that. Is that there's a logic to that kind of amplified atrocity claim to support that 9/11 framing, right? That to kind of move the Overton window of what is kind of an acceptable military response on the behalf of the Israeli military. That October 7th was such an atrocious departure from the norms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that the old norms of response, the old norms of war and restraints don't apply, right? If you're fighting the Nazis, if you're fighting Hamas, if you're fighting ISIS, if you're fighting Imperial Japan, you think Mosul, you think Hiroshima, you think Dresden, right? And we ourselves went through this with Dick Cheney also flagging to us after 9/11 that the world has changed. And I put this. I worked at the Economist at the time and was in New York, and I'm very proud of the work I did covering 9/11 that day and contributing to this cover story. But look, we too in that moment thought the world has changed, the old rules don't apply, it's now time to take the gloves off. So Israel goes on a kind of preemptive media blitz to kind of prepare the battlefield, right? The Israeli propagandists know the rules of the game, to win as much sympathy for Israel and hatred towards the enemy, allow the military campaign to go on as long as possible before world, or more precisely, American, or actually more precisely right now, opinion in the White House, to extend that before it gets shut down. And this image is from a meme going around on right-wing activist sites saying, what the hell were journalists doing alongside Hamas on this raid? Journalists, because these are independent photographers from international news organizations, they must have known in advance or were part of this thing. And the Israeli government and different propagandists responded by saying, hey, if you're a journalist and you're embedded with Hamas or near them, and you're seeing them commit war crimes and you don't stop them, you are a legitimate military target, right? Which, by the way, is not international law. And by the way, and I wanted to put up a picture of some classic works of photojournalism from previous conflicts, especially the Vietnam War, and there's one of, I think, the NVA, after it's taken over Saigon, about to execute an American supporter, and it's not the journalist's job to stop war crimes. It's our job to document them, right? Anyway, then we have other people chiming in, like former Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid says, if international media is objective and shows both sides, it serves Hamas, right?
5 minutes.
How much?
5 minutes.
Ooh. All right. So we can't help but mention that in that kind of febrile environment, it is super suspicious to see the number of journalists who've been killed. 85 since October 7th. Almost all of them Palestinians in Gaza. Families of journalists killed as well. And the comparison is, this is unlike any other kind of conflict, right? 17 journalists killed in Ukraine, and some of the worst spreading since World War II in like 3 times as much time. The war in Gaza is still getting covered. Videos are emerging from civilians. Palestinian journalists are doing heroic work. My friend and personal hero, Clarissa Ward, made the first foray into Gaza by Western media. And if you're not feeling inadequate enough, she's also got 3 kids at home. Israeli, the ban on outside media, except for those embedded with the IDF, creates a trust gap with what's coming out of Gaza that Israeli activists can employ. And it's a pointed question. Why is it that there's a trust gap if it's only Palestinians working for Western news organizations covering this? Why do we need white Western reporters to do that? But this kind of comes up, that this trust issue and the whole way in which Israel can win battles in the media conflict in the Middle East, but lose the war, comes up in a nutshell in what I'm calling the Ali Hospital media moment. I don't know if you guys remember this, but 10 days after October 7th, a bomb explodes in the courtyards of an Anglican hospital where displaced Gazans are sheltering. International media runs with the claims of the Palestinian authorities in Gaza, the Gaza Ministry of Health, that blames Israel and has a high death count, as many as 500. Media run with the story, but a lot of them even put attribution in the headline, which is unusual, right? And those of you who aren't journalists, like, if you don't see something yourself, you have to put how you know this information is true and link it to a hopefully authoritative source, right? But it's unusual to have that in the headline of the story. So by the standards of professional practice, they're all good, even if it doesn't turn out to be true. Authorities all the time make mistakes or lie, and it's not on the journalist when it happened, right? Anyone who's ever followed the coverage of the American police know that, right? But it still has a major effect. Jordan cancels the summit between Biden. Biden was right about to arrive in the region, right? But it all blows up in the, that's not a nice phrase there. But the media is embarrassed when it turns out in all probability that the explosion was caused by an errant missile from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and that the death count was probably much lower, maybe 100 to 200. The New York Times issues a limited mea culpa, but there's way more self-flagellation going on after the right-wing media smells vulnerability and goes after the Western press, talking about the blood libel against the Jewish people, journalistic crimes and coverage, the New York Post going in, and here's a progressive media outfit saying, whoa, we're hearing that lawyers in major media companies are telling everyone to quit sourcing Palestinians for facts about what's happening in Gaza. But this is the kind of thing that happens in wars, right? Just about a month earlier in Ukraine, a missile exploded, killing 17 Ukrainians right before Anthony Blinken was set to visit. And this was widely covered by the media with not even attribution in the headline, right? Russia just invaded Ukraine, is involved in an aerial campaign. Yeah, something blew up, probably the Russians. And yet it turned out that that was not the case. It was actually Ukrainian air defense gone awry. But there's no, even though there was less kind of caution and restraint on the media, there are no media postmortems and no backlash against the media there, right? So this right-wing backlash against the press at this moment helps them kind of ratchet up a bit of a victory. Ever since then, there had been a movement before this to cast suspicion on casualty figures from Gaza, from the Gaza Ministry of Health. But after this, media felt compelled to, every time these numbers come out, to put the Hamas-led Gaza Ministry of Health, to create that extra sense of distance and suspicion, right? But yet, those numbers that the Gaza Ministry of Health is putting out, pretty much scanned in past conflicts, and everyone is still using them for this conflict, including, according to Israeli media, the Israeli intelligence services. They surveyed the process of how the Hamas-led Gaza Ministry of Health is collecting these numbers, says that it checks. The IDF isn't collecting its numbers, so the intelligence is using them, right? It's also become pretty much accepted or not controversial to suggest in the media that Israel has been deliberately targeting hospitals. Here's a special package from CNN that they're targeting hospitals and not delivering much in the way of evidence that they're actually being used in any significant way by Hamas. I think we all remember the siege of Shifa Hospital, that where the IDF was saying this is the command and control center of Hamas, and then they find out, then when they finally take over, there's really just not much evidence of anything serious, and that independent media, when they finally get there, say, like, really there isn't much, and it just became a dud, right? Now it's no longer controversial to suggest that Israel is targeting civilian infrastructure, drawing on stories from Israeli media like 972 magazine that did a report on how the IDF is using AI to generate power targets, which is a euphemism for significant symbolic civilian structures, and bombing them, not because they have military use, but bombing them to demoralize the civilian population and turn them to Hamas. We have all this more information coming out, right? And Joe Biden himself has called Israel's air campaign indiscriminate, and Tom Friedman is, even pro-Israel star Tom Friedman is calling the campaign well beyond proportional, right? So now we're in a space, so as this goes on, I know we're short on time, as this continues, more and more stories are coming out like this, including stories about the occupation, which never would run. So when there is a hostage exchange, the stories are done about all the terrible treatment of Hamas's Israeli hostages, but stories start coming out about who the Palestinian prisoners are and that Israel holds, and it's controversial administrative detention practices, and it's holding of children in jail indefinitely without trial, right? And so now we're in a discussion whether in the American media, right, not whether Israel's campaign is disproportionate, but we're in the discussion is framed as is it genocide or not, right? So it's usually framed as a two-side situation when they can. Here's PBS NewsHour, two experts give their opinions. This is not a good conversation for Israel. And even the Israeli legal expert who pointing out flaws in the evidence that South Africa presented about there not links to the outrageous statements Israeli politicians are making and orders within the chain of command of the Israeli military, it's not a great look, right? And even before the ICJ came out with its report, 30% of Americans, according to a poll, believe that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, right? So meanwhile, where's Hamas, right? Right, Hamas is all over Gaza, but they're not in the news. Why is that? Part of it is they don't run an embedding program like the Israelis. But it's also, there's something really strange about Israel's military's unconvincing PR campaign about Hamas's military threat. Here's in the beginning of the war, they just weren't producing much that's showing what Hamas is up to. And some of it's what it felt that it deserved platforming by the President of the Republic was that they found a copy of Mein Kampf in Arabic in a girl's bedroom, right? Now, I don't need to show, if we went house to house in Texas, we would probably find more copies of Mein Kampf than we should, right? This is not, it's a horrible thing, but to see this, but this is not an excuse for a military campaign. And only recent, the thing is, it's really not hard to find online, figure out what Hamas is up to, right? Every day, Hamas is out there releasing what I call a kind of snuff video, which is a greatest hits tape of that day's attacks on the Israeli military, right? And if you see these, I didn't want to play this because, and for possibly some of the reasons why this isn't getting platformed by the Israeli government and the media, but if you see these things, and they're unlike anything I've seen in the conflicts that I've followed and covered. They're close quarter attacks on Israeli tanks that have a level of self-consciousness. They're often accompanied by videographers. They're returned to some location from that day's attacks. They're edited by some central PR operation. Some basic graphics are thrown in and they're released, right? You see these things and you look at this and say, this is not an organization that is about to be defeated anytime soon. Yeah, okay.
Last sentence.
Which means the Dayak doctrine is ending up being more problematic in Gaza than it is elsewhere. And why is that not showing up? Why is the Israeli military not platforming themselves? Because they've set impossible goals for their publics to in what they're doing. They said, we're going to defeat Hamas militarily in Gaza, and we're going to free those hostages. It's becoming clear that they can't do both at the same time. So they can't really platform these examples of Hamas as an actually effective, dangerous, deadly, militant organization, right? And so you're just not seeing that part of it. I think, in this discourse. Wait, sorry.
Thank you so much. We should have given you a whole hour. We're gonna, I know this session is 12 to 1, but we're gonna go over time for questions for those of you who can remain and ask some questions and perhaps have a conversation. I'll open it up to the audience, given I can, yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much for that talk. I had a question about the portrayal of hostages in this situation and how is that contributing to the conversation, and also how does the hostages speaking out about their experiences in captivity also contribute?
So first of all, it's a war crime to produce a video of anyone being held in captivity, right? So for that reason, I don't watch a lot of these things coming out of Hamas. And just like the same was true of Russian prisoners being held by Ukrainians when they make videos. So let me just think for a second here. So how this is an incredibly inflammatory issue within Israel, right? Because it seems that the government has prioritized its military campaign over releasing hostages, right? But what is Hamas, what it was intending to do by taking these hostages is it appears that this was always going to be a shit that Hamas was going to use to have an exit strategy to this conflict, like how it was going to have an end and declare victory was use those hostages to both get to have a ceasefire, hopefully a permanent one, but also to get Palestinian prisoners released and get those plaudits from the Palestinian movement. So that's the strategy of doing that, and those videos are there of Hamas's way of exasperating that political earthquake in Israel, right? That the government has not wanted to take that bait, right? And it wants to continue its campaign. And for the families of Israelis hostage, who are an incredibly powerful political force in the country, that seems like their families are going to be sacrificed on the altar of a military campaign that may or may not be going well from an Israeli perspective.
Thank you.
So you mentioned one of the most important questions is the question of Palestinians being allowed to return to Israel or Palestine. And I was thinking about the refugee camps, and I'm not aware of the numbers. I wanted to ask how many Palestinians would there be in refugee camps around
So in I think 200,000 in Lebanon in camps. There are a lot more who are who live outside of the camps, but there are about 200,000 that UNRWA serves.
And also regarding the right for a Palestinian citizen to return if they once would have immigrated to another country. I just heard from friends that civilian citizens, Palestinian citizens will not be allowed to return once they would have emigrated to another country. And I wanted to know if that's true. Another question, when you were having this undercover assignment, how did you, did you wear some clothes?
So I wasn't undercover. I can't do undercover. Like no one buys it. I once had a beard, didn't work. I dyed my beard, didn't work. I at one point I did pretend to be in an aid organization to get into one camp. But mostly I just got permission.
You mentioned one undercover assignment where you met someone who was a bomb maker. Did you go there with a suit, or did you have a backup that was looking at you, because you said the area is pretty dangerous, so that you cannot get kidnapped?
So no, I wasn't wearing body armor because there wasn't active fighting, and no, we had no backup. It was done.
You just went as a correspondent.
Yeah, we were
undercover.
there, and someone said, "Hey, there's this guy from Al Qaeda who lives that way. You want to go? I said, sure.
One last question. What do you see the civilian like Palestine in Palestine for Hamas? Like they have voted for Hamas. It's their government. So how do you see that this playing into the conflict? That the civilians are in favor of.
So that's an interesting question. It comes up. So almost everywhere I went in the Middle East, in freer and unfree societies, people were incredibly kind to me as an American, even if my country was at war with their country, my country had done terrible things to their country, and people would always say, we know governments are different from people, right? And that was a distinction that people in the Arab world and the Middle East could easily make. And even though, you could say we bear a whole lot more responsibility for the nature and content of our government policies than people in unfree societies do. So I find that argument that if you voted for a government that takes you down a path of militancy, that takes its society down a path of war, that then the people in that society are legitimate targets, I find it just abhorrent.
In the back.
You were talking about how the Western coverage is really coming out of New York, DC, and Jerusalem because of lack of access to Gaza. I'm wondering about investigations that we're seeing. I remember one in particular from the New York Times. It was an in-depth investigation on the use of sexual violence in Gaza. And to be honest, I didn't read it, but if there is that kind of lack of access, what are these in-depth investigations when they're doing a deeper dive, the Western media, what do these look like? Are they how are they formulated?
Well, I mean, that particular issue, I imagine involved, and I did read the story, involved interviews and research not in Gaza, right? So, it's just, these things usually involve going, finding the sources, the victims, the governments, the organizations that represent them or take care of them, and talking to them. And I mean, I'm not sure how to answer, in short form, what it takes to do an in-depth investigative project, but it just involves going back to the original sources. With any story about where victims are traumatized and involves atrocity or abuse, this is always difficult because there are really good reasons for someone not to want to talk to the media, right? So ever since the Sandy Hook shooting, there's a cottage industry, basically started here in Austin by InfoWars of saying that crisis actors or victims of mass atrocity are acting. There's a certain element of all of that happening in this conflict. Right? And so you can see why people might not want to talk about and why this is a hard subject to get around, and why I almost don't even want to get into it here.
I ran our foreign news coverage for NBC Nightly News for 20 years. I mentioned that my first war was in 1982, going into Beirut, trying to get Arafat out and the PLO out. I, every single day for 20 years, would try and get the Mideast story on when it was in the news. And part of the challenge was, how do you get America to pay attention? Because you have this sort of syndrome called wither Mideast peace. Everyone feels like they've heard it over and over again. And one of the things that I did with our correspondent, Martin Fletcher, over the years was literally put a face. Find a way to tell the story to get people to pay attention. It might be telling the story of a child in Gaza who was hit by a Israeli IDF sniper bullet and following him. In that case, we did one one child who was hit at 11, we kept following him over the years, over and over again. We would do a day in the life of a hospital, showing what was going on. We would be at a UN school. We would be doing the inside the mind of a bomber who had been stopped at a checkpoint. But it was very important for us to try and show that there were two sides to the story. One thing I would say in terms of the Western media right now, and I have the greatest respect for Clarissa Ward, and I know she went in with the UAE medic team into Gaza. We've had a bureau there for 40 years, and I worked with our team all the time there, and they are trusted journalists. I'm sure the New York Times, I don't know if Time Magazine had a bureau in Gaza. We certainly have one in Ramallah as well. And these are people, they may not have American passports, but I have the greatest respect for the integrity of their journalism. And right now, I think one of the things that has really made a difference in this coverage is those teams have been working with our bureaus in London and New York and whatever, putting a face on what's happening on the street in Gaza and inside the bombings, and telling you the stories of those families and children who are pulled out of the rubble after these bombings. And we've had, Richard Engel had a story on Nightly News the other night about a father and his two daughters who had been pulled out of that rubble, and he was now with them in Istanbul as the girls were getting medical coverage. So I don't think that you literally have to have a Martin Fletcher or a Time Magazine correspondent who has an American passport on the scene if you trust the people in your bureau. I mean, I think that they have the same journalistic principles if they are working for an organization like ours. And I think they've made a very strong difference in putting a face on the story. So when we talk about it turning, I would spend the perception of what Israel's doing inside of Gaza is churning. I think, that day in, day out hard work that kind of storytelling has made a difference.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for the response to that question I posed about. Does it matter? Thank you for your response to that question that I posed. Does it matter if our, Western face is there or not?
Yeah. Question over here.
Sure.
Yeah, based on the distinction you made earlier between governments and people, and I think it's an important one, so you can bring that up. How do you think that plays into the Israeli drafting? Like, everyone in Israel has to get drafted into the military, like, unless you're like the Hasidim or like the ultra religious don't generally have to.
Yeah.
But the fact that the entire society participates in the military, like, how do you think that plays into its perception of Palestinians and the perception of Palestinians of Israelis?
So, I mean, first of all, international law is pretty clear. Like, if you're not wearing a uniform and don't have a gun, and you're a target if you're in uniform, if you have a gun, or you're actively fighting, right? So even in a situation where, there was a targeted killing in a hospital in the West Bank the other night by Israeli commandos in disguise of someone who's possibly a militant, but who may have been unconscious and in a hospital, which was not someone on the field of combat, and so that would have been an illegal killing. So Hamas going in and raiding kibbutzes and killing, reservists who are off duty, teenagers who are IDFs, and then the kind of keyboard mujahideen chiming in where they were legitimate targets because they were just soldiers who were off duty. That's not, that doesn't hold water under any kind of international law or kind of or way of covering a conflict, right? So, but the broader issue, and I'm sure there are people who can speak more deeply about the relationship between Israeli society and culture and the military is a big one, and it means that people really feel the risk of war and loss very, very keenly. Does that make Israel more militant, or does it make Israeli parents more wary of war? Because their sons and daughters actually have to fight in the wars that their politicians start, unlike the children of politicians in this country.
So all in all, it doesn't seem like Hamas, in that they're trained to do what they do, at least one part of the group, correct?
Sorry?
Hamas is trained to do what it does.
Yeah. Yeah, they have a militant wing that is,
They're a militant wing.
yeah.
They do something, but certainly not in the best interest of Palestinians.
Broadly speaking, if you think that that war is a dead end, yeah.
It's like, I like to think of it as shooting fish in a barrel. How is that
Yeah,
going to
the chances of this ending with a Palestinian state alongside of an Israeli state after the fog of war clears and the bodies stack up and is pretty minimal. On the other hand, there was no movement towards a Palestinian state before this, so that's the question about militancy. I think the broader question is, what are we doing? Why do we only respond when there's militancy? Why didn't we pay attention to the occupation when it wasn't news and craft policies and things that didn't lead us down to this road where it's increasingly looks like there's chances of there being a return to civilian life or slum.
Well, if we could try to keep, if there's any more questions, if we could
There
try
is
to...
one more question, Safi, and I'll take that and then we'll close up.
Okay. I was just gonna ask specifically to try to stay on the topic of media coverage rather than the war.
That's okay. I run this series, Safi, so
Yeah.
I'm paying attention.
Okay,
It's
alright,
okay.
sorry.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Mine's about media. There's been a lot of stories that we talked about, like the back and forth, and then it feels like the media doesn't frequently cover like closure. And I'm wondering why this is. So for example, like the sexual violence, there's been like the whole like Zakat's organization coming out, and it feels like the Israeli news sources will cover this, but the American news sources are not. I don't frequently see like further research and like closure stories on this. I'm wondering, is this just the conflict is moving too fast? Is this American short attention span? Is it because it's inconclusive? And also like not specifically the sexual violence, like the hostage stories that are coming out, various like conspiracies, just the topic in general.
So, I mean, for lots of reasons. So Israeli media is going to do a better job of covering Israel than American media is, right?
Yeah.
Okay. To an extent, right? Because we all have blind spots when it comes to our own societies too, right? Or otherwise, there's no need for a foreign correspondent. I'd be talking myself out of a job. So, and so some of the ways in which, Israel, it's fascinating watching Israel. They are so much more honest about some things than Western media coverage is, and then there are blind spots as well. So as far as I can tell, I'm told that what I've been reading, there's not much coverage of the human costs of the war in Gaza on Israeli TV, but there's a lot better information about the workings of Israeli military strategy, of detention policy, of all kinds of things like that. Right?
Second question is, if you know the answer to this, do you think that the media consumption by the younger generation has changed in reference to what we're seeing on New York Times, like major news outlets? There's been claims that like Gen Z, right, is like more involved in this than they have been. Are we seeing trends on what they're interested in? Did I miss this in the first
So I didn't end
Okay.
it, but I think the result of all of this, right, is that there's a breakup going on in our society with media, right? And a lot of this is the fault lines in age and political persuasion, and a lot of it's over these culture war issues. And I don't think there's a permanent break going on between the Western media and Israel over this, because as soon as the shooting stops, I think the Western media will default to its comfortable positions, which is both sides, right? I think there's going to be a permanent break between Israel against Western media, because Trump has shown how that's really good politics, right? And because there's a gap between how Israelis are perceiving their experience and how it's being covered, even in the sympathetic Western media, right? And then there's going to be breaks. This is going to be adding to the break in public trust with the news over a generation that's getting a lot of this from social media, that's getting these straight media, and seeing our political and media class treat this at arm's length. Yeah.
If it's a quick one, I think we have to shut this room
Could you
down.
just comment in passing the media coverage of the city council voting for the ceasefire thing, and the freedom of speech in universities, those two topics that are on the media every day?
So the media war, and this is in part has come to our communities, right? And very quickly, I think that's a deliberate project, right? And one that I resent, because people in power have failed to solve this problem for 40, 50 years. And so this attempt to regulate the behavior and discourses of college-age students and put onuses on them of having dealing with this topic in a certain way, it's like, that the people in power should be leading by example, and that this isn't something that we should be having to worry about whether we can hold events.
On that note, thank you so much, Professor Butters. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you also to Safi over there, who's facilitated this meeting. Thank you. Thanks, Norma. Thank you, Tamara. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. It was really wonderful.